Clara was sitting alone in a small cafe downtown, her eyes fixed on a cup of cold coffee she'd barely touched. The world moved busily around her, but none of it seemed to cut through the fog of thoughts surrounding her. Her mind had been restless ever since she'd left the hospital a few weeks ago, after the accident. She tried to recall every detail of that day, but all she could remember were fragments: the sharp screech of tires on asphalt, the blinding glow of headlights, and then, total darkness. After that, everything was a blur. As she stared blankly at her cup, her phone vibrated in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. She absent-mindedly pulled it out and saw a new notification. It was a video. Her finger hesitated for a moment before tapping the screen, but curiosity overpowered the strange feeling in her gut. When the video started, Clara felt her heartbeat pick up speed. On the screen, she saw herself in a room she didn't recognize, a place with white walls, cold and impersonal. In the background, a window let in pale, muted light, casting an eerie glow on her tired, worn-out expression. But what disturbed her the most was that she had no memory of ever being in that room, or of recording that video. In the video, Clara looked like she was talking to someone. Her mouth was moving, but there was no sound, and she couldn't make out the words. She watched as her own hand gestured towards something out of view. It was her, same blonde hair, same slightly narrow eyes that hinted at exhaustion. Yet, something about her own expression felt wrong, almost foreign. The disconnect hit her so strongly that she had to look away from the screen, a chill running down her spine. She closed the video and sat there, motionless, her phone still clutched in her hand. The question, "What is happening to me?" echoed in her mind. Trying not to let the panic take over, Clara opened her photo gallery and hesitantly began scrolling through the contents. She couldn't find anything like that particular video, but as she looked deeper, she found something even more unsettling: several photos and videos of herself in unfamiliar places, interacting with faces she didn't recognize. It was as if a parallel life was unfolding in secret, a life she wasn't consciously living, yet was somehow being documented on her own phone. Clara scrolled through the images and videos faster now, desperately looking for some kind of pattern, something that would make sense of it all, but all she found was confusion. In one of the videos, she saw herself sitting on a park bench, staring blankly at the horizon. In another, she was in a hospital setting, speaking to a doctor she didn't recognize. Each image seemed carefully recorded, as if someone were leaving her clues, or reminders. Reminders of what? She couldn't say. Closing the gallery, she felt her stomach twist with anxiety. It was as if she were no longer in control of her own life. She stayed there, trying to decide if this was just confusion from the accident or if something much deeper was going on. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again, and instinctively, she glanced at the screen. A new message had arrived. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You don't know who you really are." Clara felt frozen in place. The unsettling message remained on her screen as Clara tried to process what was happening. She read and reread the words, almost as if she was searching for a hidden meaning, a key to unlock the truth. What was it trying to say? Who was sending these messages, and why? There was a fine line between fear and curiosity, and Clara felt suspended on it, struggling to keep her balance without falling. She knew she needed answers. Something deep inside told her she had to investigate. Over the next few hours, Clara rummaged through her belongings, hoping to find anything that could explain these events. She searched through old papers, folders on her computer, files on her phone. Then, suddenly, she found a medical note tucked away at the bottom of a drawer, hidden among her personal documents. She picked it up with trembling fingers, unfolded it, and began to read. It was a report from the hospital where she'd been treated after the accident. The report indicated partial memory loss, but what caught her attention was an added detail: experimental treatment conducted using memory storage technology. Clara frowned. Those words triggered a faint memory, something she could barely grasp. Suddenly, she remembered that, right after the accident, the doctors had suggested an alternative treatment. At the time, she hadn't been in any state to fully understand what it meant, but it seemed to be a new way of digitally storing memories to preserve information in cases of memory loss. A chill ran down her spine. The technology was known, but she'd never liked the idea of having her memories stored in a device. Yet, somehow, she must have agreed to it. She was living proof of it. Determined to find out what had really happened to her, Clara opened the memory recording app on her phone. Although she was uncomfortable revisiting her own memories through a technology she found invasive, she knew this was her only chance at answers. She began accessing short videos that recorded fragments of her past, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Each clip showed scenes that seemed ordinary, but with something slightly out of place. She noticed details that disturbed her, the feeling that she was watching someone else's life unfold. One of the most unsettling videos showed Clara walking through a park at night, with a strange hand holding her arm. She couldn't see the person's face, only heard a soft yet sinister voice whispering something about forgetting everything. A shiver went down her spine, and she quickly closed the video, but the need to continue was overwhelming. Every fragment of memory seemed carefully edited, as if someone wanted her to see only select parts, leaving her unable to understand the bigger picture. Confusion began turning into paranoia. She no longer knew who to trust, and the idea that her mind was being manipulated by a system beyond her control was pushing her toward panic. She decided to reach out to her closest friends, someone who could help her connect the dots and make sense of what was happening. She called Mia, her best friend since childhood. When Mia picked up, Clara tried to explain everything as calmly as possible, but it all came out rushed and fragmented. Mia listened in silence, but after a pause, all she could say was, "Clara, you just need rest. Maybe it's all just the trauma talking." When Clara hung up, she felt even more isolated. If even Mia didn't believe her, who would? The world around her seemed to be slipping away, breaking into disconnected pieces like the videos she'd watched. Realizing she'd have to face this alone, Clara went back to her phone, determined to watch every last recording, ignoring the growing discomfort. The idea that her own life was slipping out of her control haunted her, but she knew she had to keep going, no matter how painful each new answer might be. As she watched the remaining videos, a new thought began to form in her mind: what if she was being watched? Clara spent the entire night going through every fragment of memory, but the more she searched, the farther she felt from reality. The idea of being watched seemed absurd, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of something bigger, something deliberate. She felt observed, manipulated, and the fear that someone was controlling her mind grew, making her increasingly suspicious. She tried to stay calm, but her desperation mounted with each realization that no one around her seemed trustworthy anymore. The next morning, Clara woke up to the sound of a new notification on her phone. It was a message from an unknown number, and her heart started racing. The text was short, just a single phrase that echoed her deepest fears: "Remember, you don't know who you really are." The words brought back the memory of that first message, and she realized that someone was definitely trying to tell her something, or possibly manipulate her memories. What could it mean? Who could this person be? Each attempt to understand only raised more questions, each more unsettling than the last. For a second, Clara thought about blocking the number. Maybe ignoring these messages would be the best way to keep from losing her mind entirely, but she quickly dismissed the idea. She knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she understood what was going on. Maybe these messages were her only real chance at finding the truth, and she'd have to face her fear, even if every revelation felt like it was pulling her towards something terrifying. The only thing she knew for certain was that nothing in her life felt reliable anymore, not even her own memories. Taking a deep breath, she decided to reply. Her fingers hesitated before she finally typed, "Who are you?" Minutes passed with no response, and Clara's anxiety began to build. She kept glancing at her phone, waiting for the stranger to reply, but nothing came. The silence stretched on, making her wonder if she was imagining all of this, if any of it was even real. But then, at noon, a new message appeared. This time, it seemed like a direct clue: look for the park. You'll find answers there. No explanations, no further details. Clara read and reread the message, trying to make sense of it or uncover any hidden intent behind those words. The park. The memory of the video where she'd been walking at night, led by a shadowy figure, came rushing back, sending a chill through her. Something about that memory was terrifying, but she knew she had to check it out for herself. If there was any chance that it would help her fill in the gaps in her mind, then she had to take it. Without telling anyone, Clara took a taxi to the park. The place was nearly empty, a wide, quiet area of trees and shrubs that seemed to absorb all the sounds of the city around it. The feeling of being watched intensified as she walked. She followed the stone path deeper into the park, each step echoing inside her mind. She felt like she could find something at any moment, a clue left there just for her. Every slight movement of a branch or shadow felt sinister, but at the same time, she couldn't ignore the pull to keep going. Clara walked to an isolated spot, where she found an old, worn wooden bench, exactly like the one from the recordings. The déjà vu was overwhelming. She sat down, looking around and trying to piece together everything she'd seen in the videos. Then, without warning, her phone buzzed again. Another message appeared, this time in the form of a video. Her hand trembled as she tapped the screen to watch. In the video, she was in the park, on that very same bench, but it was nighttime. She sat alone, staring straight at the camera, as if she knew she'd be seen later. Her expression was cold, almost empty, as if she were fully aware that she was being watched. In a distant, detached voice, she whispered, "I know what they're doing to me. But it's too late to escape." The present-day Clara felt her blood turn to ice as she heard her own words. What Clara had just watched left her in a state of shock. She played the video several times, trying to make sense of what she had done, where she had been, or even when she had recorded that haunting message. None of it seemed to add up. If that was her voice, her face, why couldn't she remember any of it? And why had she mentioned them? Who were these people who apparently controlled her? Still shaken, Clara went home, feeling exhausted and desperate. Her mind was flooded with questions, but each one only seemed to deepen the mystery. It was hard to accept that the person in the video was really her, that the voice she'd heard was her own. Determined to find answers, she reviewed the medical report she'd found in the hospital. The term experimental treatment echoed in her mind, like a crucial clue she hadn't fully understood. The report suggested that, after the accident, Clara had been one of the first patients to undergo a highly experimental procedure aimed at preserving memories in cases of severe trauma or prolonged unconsciousness. The concept was that, by digitally storing memories, the patient could retrieve specific fragments even after a serious accident. She vaguely remembered the doctors discussing the technology with her after the accident, but still in shock, she'd accepted the treatment without fully questioning it, eager to recover any detail that might aid in her recovery. However, as she reread the report more carefully, Clara noticed a disturbing detail. The technology involved not only the storage of memories but also a process that duplicated the patient's consciousness, replicating it to test functionality before full recovery. She froze as she read that. It was as if she had been transformed into a copy of herself, an experimental version created to test the technology's effectiveness before any permanent reversal. But if the experiment was really that advanced, why could she only recall fragments? And if she was truly a copy, what had happened to her original body? A growing sense of dread filled Clara. The thought that she might not be entirely real, but instead a product of someone else's manipulation, made her feel even more unsettled. This life she was living might not truly be her own, but rather something constructed by others for an unknown purpose. At that moment, Clara decided to return to the hospital, hoping to confront the doctors about what they had done. If she'd agreed to something like this, there had to be a document, some detailed record explaining the procedure. The idea that everything she knew as real could be artificial, created by others, was unbearable. But at the same time, it was better to face that horrifying truth than to keep living in a state of uncertainty. Once at the hospital, Clara went straight to reception and asked to speak with one of the doctors who had treated her after the accident. A receptionist, after checking the records, informed her that the lead doctor was unavailable. Clara insisted, and was finally directed to a nurse who had handled her follow-up care. When she asked him about the experimental treatment, the nurse hesitated, looking at her with a mix of surprise and worry. He pulled her aside to a quiet corner of the hallway, away from other staff. "You weren't supposed to know about this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Then he revealed something even more disturbing. Her original body was still in the hospital, in a deep coma, under intensive care. She felt hollow. If her original body was here, then who, or what, was she? The nurse seemed hesitant to say more, but seeing Clara's stunned expression, he went on, "You're part of a digital memory experiment. You were created to replace the original you until she could wake up." But something went wrong. The nurse's words echoed in Clara's mind as she tried to absorb that reality. Clara left the hallway where she'd spoken to the nurse, but his words kept ringing in her mind. Her original body was still here, in the hospital, in a coma, while she was. A replacement? A replica? The reality she thought she understood was unraveling, leaving her adrift in a crisis of identity. Taking a deep breath, Clara realized she needed to confront this truth head-on. If there was a chance to see her original body, to confirm this impossible reality, she had to take it right now. Fighting the rising anxiety in her chest, Clara followed the nurse to a remote wing of the hospital. The silence of the corridors weighed heavily, making the air feel thick, and her footsteps echoed like something out of a nightmare. Finally, the nurse led her into a sterile, spacious room where a single bed lay in the center. On the bed, surrounded by machines that monitored every vital sign, was a still figure. It was her. Clara froze, unable to comprehend the scene in front of her. She approached slowly, her steps faltering, and stared down at the familiar face, her original body. The version of Clara lying there looked paler and more fragile, identical but with a serene expression, as though in a deep, peaceful sleep. The sight was surreal, a reflection of herself caught in a limbo between life and death. Clara's heart pounded as the sense of unreality grew stronger. That was her body, but at the same time, it wasn't. She felt an urge to reach out and touch the arm of her sleeping self, but hesitated. What did this mean? If her original body was here, then what was she? As she struggled to make sense of this, the nurse who had led her there looked at her with a mix of compassion and pity. "This treatment was done on an experimental basis," he explained, breaking the silence. "They used your memories to create an autonomous version of you. You're a copy, a simulation based on your recollections. The idea was for you to temporarily live until the original body was ready to wake up." The words sounded cold, clinical, but they were enough for Clara to understand the depth of what was happening. She wasn't her. Or, at least, not in the way she had believed. Clara was a version created from her own memories, a living, but artificial, reflection. The emptiness of this realization cut through her like a knife. Every memory she had of her life, every feeling, every moment, were they real, or just replicas of what the real Clara had experienced? Trying to process the flood of information, Clara felt her legs weaken, and she had to grip the edge of the bed to stay upright. She stared at the peaceful face of her comatose self, searching for answers in her own image. How was this even possible? She knew she needed more answers, but at the same time each new discovery felt like a blow, weakening her further. "So why am I conscious?" she whispered, more to herself than to the nurse. The man shrugged, clearly reluctant to answer, but after a long pause, he finally said in a low voice, "Something went wrong in the procedure." The implanted consciousness began to develop autonomy, maybe due to the complexity of your memories and emotions. "Something in you woke up." Clara stared into space, absorbing his words. She was a mistake, an anomaly in an experiment meant to be controlled and safe. A shadow of herself, without real roots. The pain of that discovery was crushing, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. She didn't belong to the real world, and yet every feeling, every memory felt so authentic that the doubt gnawed at her from within. In that moment, Clara realized she had a terrible choice ahead: accept her condition, or fight to exist. As she looked at her sleeping body, Clara understood that her future depended on her. The following days were a haze of confusion and anguish for Clara. The revelation that her very existence was an anomaly, a kind of shadow, had left her shaken but also determined to understand the full truth. It was as if each new discovery only deepened the mystery. She had to find the people responsible for the procedure and demand answers about what was really happening to her. As she combed through hospital records and documents, Clara found the name of the corporation behind the experimental treatment, a biotech company called Neurogenesis, which operated out of a remote facility. With what little she knew, she sensed that the secrets of her condition were hidden there. And to get there, she would have to risk everything. She knew that once she confronted those responsible, there would be no going back, but with each minute she didn't act, the feeling of losing herself grew stronger. Resolved, Clara tracked down the Neurogenesis location and left without telling anyone. She arrived at the company's unmarked building in an isolated area, surrounded by high walls and security systems that seemed to reinforce the idea that dark secrets lay hidden inside. When she tried to enter, she was stopped by guards who refused her entry, but after insisting, Clara was led to an empty, cold, windowless waiting room. She waited alone in a heavy silence that felt like it was pressing down on her. A man in formal attire eventually entered, his expression serious, and introduced himself simply as Dr. Lawson. "Clara," he began, as if struggling to keep his composure for a difficult conversation, "we know how disturbing this must be for you, but you need to understand that your creation was an essential step in advancing medical science. Your case was a rare experiment, not intended to become autonomous, but somehow, you developed consciousness. Which puts us in an unprecedented situation." Dr. Lawson's words hit Clara like a punch. "You knew there was a risk of autonomy, and you still went through with the experiment?" Her emotions spilled out, every word sharp with anger and desperation. The man hesitated before finally admitting, "Yes, we knew the risk, but we believed that any anomaly would be temporary. What we didn't foresee was that you would wake up. That you would start looking for answers." The revelation felt surreal. Clara was more than a failed experiment, she was the result of a calculated decision, an experiment that had turned her into a living copy, but without an identity of her own. She felt an intense anger, as though her very essence was being stolen. "So what do you plan to do now? Erase my memories? Shut me down like I'm just a defective program?" Dr. Lawson watched her silently, but the cold gleam in his eyes was enough for her to understand his answer even before he spoke. "We have to protect the project, Clara. Neurogenesis's purpose is to ensure that the knowledge gained here benefits millions. For that to happen, you need to be reintegrated. Reintegrated. The word felt cold and impersonal, as if Clara were just a part of a larger system, disposable and replaceable. She felt a sudden, intense need to escape, to survive. She knew her time was running out. She saw the determined look in Dr. Lawson's eyes and the way he subtly gestured for the guards to move closer, and she realized that this was her final sentence. She had to act quickly, or lose whatever little remained of herself. With a strength she didn't know she had, she shoved Dr. Lawson, taking advantage of his momentary distraction, and ran down the corridor. Alarms blared, footsteps pounded behind her, but Clara kept running, fighting to escape this prison of stolen memories. Clara ran down the cold hallways of neurogenesis, each step echoing in her ears like a ticking clock counting down. She knew that if they caught her, they would try to reintegrate her, a term she now understood to be a final, ominous threat. Every step was a race against time, against her very existence slipping away. The alarms blared louder, and she could hear the shouts of the guards chasing her, their footsteps thundering from all directions, ready to trap her at any moment. At the end of one hallway, she spotted a door and dashed through it, only to find herself in an archive room. Around her were shelves filled with documents and files, likely recording every experiment conducted by the company. The urge to flee battled with the need to finally understand what they had done to her. Her hands shook as she rifled through the shelves, and then she found a file with her name. She pulled it out quickly, flipping through the papers, and her eyes landed on one chilling sentence: temporary implant. Reversion to original condition upon experiment success. Clara felt her chest tighten. It was confirmation of what she had feared: she was never meant to continue existing. Her purpose was temporary, a convenient replacement while her original body remained in a coma. But now she knew she was more than that. She had exceeded the limits that neurogenesis had placed on her. She'd become more than they'd planned for. She deserved to exist, to claim the right to her life beyond their control. Just as she was processing this revelation, she heard approaching footsteps, and she shoved the file into her bag before bolting out of the room, searching desperately for an escape route. She spotted an emergency stairwell at the end of the hall and ran toward it, taking the stairs down as fast as her legs would carry her. The alarm seemed louder with every step, but she blocked out the sound, focusing only on getting out of there. Her heart pounded as fear gave way to something bigger: the determination to survive. Finally, she reached the ground floor and found an emergency exit that led to an empty parking lot at the back of the building. Without a second thought, she ran into the darkness, trying to steady her breathing as she put distance between herself and that nightmare. The cold night air was a jarring relief, proof that she was still here, still alive. But Clara knew she wasn't safe yet. She had to get as far away from the company as possible before they caught up with her. She spotted a car parked nearby, keys still in the ignition, likely belonging to an employee. In any other situation, she might have hesitated, but in that moment, she knew she couldn't afford to pass up the opportunity. She jumped in, started the car, and sped away, still feeling her heart racing. As the distance between her and neurogenesis grew, a single thought became clearer in her mind: she had to expose what the company was doing. It was her only chance to keep existing. As she drove down the deserted road, Clara began planning her next steps. She knew neurogenesis would hunt her down, that they wouldn't let her live after what she discovered. Her first priority would be to find a safe place to study the documents she'd taken, then figure out a way to make the information public. She knew that if she could reveal the project, she might be able to put an end to neurogenesis and the experiments that threatened to erase her very existence. Clara drove through the night, her mind racing with possibilities but also weighed down by the enormity of what she'd learned. At dawn, she found a small roadside motel and checked in, locking herself in the room with the documents from neurogenesis. Her head throbbed as she pored over every line, uncovering disturbing details about the memory duplication project and the experiments that had been carried out on others, people who, like her, had become shadows of their former selves. The documents revealed that Clara wasn't the only one. The company had conducted several similar experiments before, but she was the first to achieve full consciousness, and that had made her a liability. Neurogenesis could not allow its copies to develop autonomy, the same self-awareness Clara had gained. And that made her disposable. She felt betrayed, outraged, but also strangely resolute. She knew she had to share this information, expose to the world what really went on behind the walls of neurogenesis. In the pile of papers, she found contact information for a journalist who had previously investigated neurogenesis, though he'd never managed to obtain enough evidence to expose the company's secrets. She knew he was her best chance. Her hands trembling, she typed out a message, attached the documents, and included a summary of her story. Taking a deep breath, she hit send. The response was almost instant, and the journalist, intrigued, asked her to meet him in the city the next day. The following morning, Clara arrived at the designated meeting spot, a discreet cafe downtown. She felt exposed, as though she could be recognized at any moment, but she knew this was her only shot. The journalist greeted her with a curious look and a slight air of disbelief as he listened to her story, describing the horror of discovering that she was a copy of herself, a conscious but unintended experiment. He listened intently, taking notes, and when she finished, he assured her that he would investigate thoroughly and publish everything. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. As she left the cafe, however, she noticed two men standing across the street, their gaze fixed on her. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she started walking quickly toward her car, trying not to appear panicked. But as she picked up her pace, she realized the men were following her. She broke into a run, reached her car, and pulled away just as she caught sight of one of them wearing a neurogenesis badge. She knew there was no turning back now. Clara drove as far as she could, heading toward an uncertain future, but this time, she had something she hadn't before, the knowledge that her story would be told. She understood that by exposing the company, by sharing her story with the world, she was fighting for more than just her own life. She was fighting for every person who had been manipulated and discarded, just like her. As the road stretched out before her, Clara felt a mix of fear and freedom. She might disappear, but her story would live on.